You've been told agriculture was a disaster. Shorter bodies, rotten teeth, harder lives than the hunter-gatherers who came before. All of that is true. Here's what almost nobody adds next. A small group of people, no matter how healthy, can be erased by a single bad year, a single disease, a single string of bad luck. A larger, more connected population can take the same hit and still be standing afterward. Agriculture didn't just grow the number of humans on Earth, it built something sturdier than any small band of healthy hunters ever was. And that sturdiness is the part of the story worth telling. Let's start with the part everyone already knows. In 1987, a scientist named Jared Diamond published an essay with a brutal title, "The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race." He had bones to back it up. Picture a graveyard in Illinois called Dixon Mounds. Skeletons buried there span the exact stretch of time when local people switched from hunting and gathering to farming corn. Before farming, the average man stood about 177 centimeters tall. After farming, that same population averaged closer to 170 centimeters. 7 centimeters, gone, over several generations. More cavities, more bone stress, more iron deficiency. This wasn't one unusual graveyard. A massive academic survey called Paleopathology at the Origins of Agriculture, led by researchers Mark Nathan Cohen and George Armalagos, pulled the same pattern from skeletons across Europe, the Middle East, and North America. Farming spreads in, height drops, disease climbs. That part of the story is real, and it shouldn't be softened. But a skeleton can only tell you about one body in one lifetime. It can't tell you whether the group that body belonged to was still standing 100 years later, or 300. And that's the question that actually decides whether something was good for people, not just hard on them. Here's a smaller story, but it's a useful warning about how easily a number gets twisted into a myth. In 1972, an anthropologist named Marshall Salins took an old set of field notes and turned them into one of the most quoted facts about prehistory. Hunter-gatherers, he said, worked only about 15 hours a week. Paradise, basically. The notes came from a real researcher, Richard Lee, who really had timed the Juhwansi people of the Kalahari hunting and gathering food. There was just one problem. In 1981, two other anthropologists, Kristen Hawkes and James O'Connell, noticed something didn't add up. They were studying a different group entirely, the Ache of Paraguay, and clocking something close to 70 hours a week of work. 70, next to Lee's 15. That's not a small gap. That's almost 5 times the workload in two groups living the same basic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So they went back and checked Lee's definition of work. And there it was. Lee had only counted the hours people spent out in the bush, actively searching for and catching food. He hadn't counted the walk back. He hadn't counted butchering the meat. He hadn't counted carrying water, minding children, gathering firewood, fixing a broken spear, or cleaning the camp. All real labor. None of it on the clock. Once later, researchers, including Lee himself in his own follow-up work, added that labor back in, the real number for the Juhwansi, came out well over 40 hours a week, not 15, a full work week, before a single seed had ever gone into the ground. The 15-hour figure didn't survive because it was accurate. It survived because it was simple, and it fit a story people already wanted to believe. So if the hunting life wasn't the relaxed paradise people imagine, what was it actually missing that farming life had? Picture two villages, 3,000 years ago, a short walk apart. These two villages make the comparison easiest to see. One survives on whatever the land freely gives. The other plants rows of wheat in the same field, season after season. The farming village has worse teeth, shorter children, more sickness in bad years. If you only measured the bodies, you'd call the farming village the worst place to live. Now wait for one bad winter, a winter with almost no game, or one harsh enough to scatter the herds the hunting village depends on. The hunting village has no stored food to fall back on. What it eats, it finds that same week. The farming village has a granary, grain that was harvested months ago, sitting in storage. Doesn't care whether this winter is kind. That single difference is the line between a band that survives a famine and a band that doesn't. There's a hard ceiling on the hunting village that the farming village simply doesn't have. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar spent years measuring how large a hunter-gatherer group can actually get before it falls apart. His answer? A band typically tops out around 30 to 50 people, and even the largest, most tightly bonded human groups struggle to hold together much past 150. That's not a cultural choice. It's closer to a wall. Geneticists, who later compared ancient DNA from European farmers and foragers, found the gap in real numbers. The effective population size of early farming communities was roughly 5 times that of the hunter-gatherers living right next to them. Same continent, same era. One side simply had 5 times the people the other side's lifestyle could ever support. A field of wheat produces more usable calories per acre than wild land ever could. More stored calories meant children could be weaned earlier instead of nursing for years. Earlier weaning meant mothers could have more children, faster. None of those changes looked dramatic on their own. Stacked together across centuries, they let farming villages grow steadily larger than any hunting band ever could. Not in one explosive leap, but generation after generation, year after year. And a larger, better-fed population wasn't just a bigger number sitting in one place. It was a sturdier kind of society, one that could absorb a disaster a small band simply couldn't survive. Take disaster directly. In the 1340s, a plague called the Black Death tore through Europe and killed an estimated 40% of the entire population in just a few years, one of the deadliest disasters in human history. A hunter-gatherer band of 30 people losing 40% of its members doesn't recover. It often simply ends. There aren't enough people left to hunt, raise children, and hold the group together at the same time. But Europe's farming-based towns, despite losing nearly half their people, rebuilt their populations within about 2 centuries. They had enough scale, enough stored grain, enough scattered settlements still standing, to grow back from a wound that would have erased a small band completely. That isn't a story about who won. It's a story about which kind of society could take a near-fatal hit and still have a future on the other side of it. Population size doesn't just affect survival, it affects memory. Researchers Joseph Henrich and Michael Muthukrishna describe human knowledge as something that lives not in any one skull, but across an entire connected population, something they call a collective brain. The bigger and more connected that population is, the more knowledge it can hold on to across generations, because no single person ever has to remember everything alone. There's a stark warning case for what happens without that scale. When rising seas cut Tasmania off from mainland Australia around 12,000 years ago, the small, isolated population there didn't just stay simple. They lost skills and technologies their ancestors once had. Too few connected minds to keep the knowledge alive. A larger, more connected population doesn't just survive better. It forgets less, and it keeps building on what it already knew, instead of losing pieces of it every generation. And that's really this missing half of the agriculture story. Yes, people often became shorter, sicker, and worked harder. But they also built societies that could survive disasters, preserve knowledge, and endure. Here's where this lands on you, directly. Evolution never promised humans the healthiest life possible. It only favors the lifestyles that keep producing descendants. The body you're sitting in right now exists because, somewhere in your family tree, a farmer endured a harder life and still raised children in a community resilient enough to survive bad years. That farmer's genes are still running in your body today. Agriculture came with real costs, but it built societies that could survive disasters and endure. That's not a trap. That's the closest thing our species ever found to an actual foundation.